Hey, it's Sheila, Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sheila's Social Studies. Alright, so today we're going to cover the economy during the 1920s, cultures and societies. So nearing the end of World War I, the United States fell immediately into a recession, or a general decline in economic activity caused by a widespread drop in spending, which lasted from the end of 1918 through the majority of 1919. This is partially because of the huge adjustments that were happening on American soil regarding the connection between the war and the economy. The United States government canceled billions of dollars worth of contracts with businesses that produced war supplies, and millions of soldiers left the military and took many of their jobs back, contributing to a large spike in unemployment of women, as well as the millions of Mexican and African Americans who traveled north to take factory jobs that were abandoned at the start of the war. Prices on goods soared, and the salary of the factory laborer could not keep up with the rising prices, leading to strikes across the nation. Labor unions and millions of workers went on strike, demanding more pay to be able to afford the new standard of living. Many Americans blamed Woodrow Wilson's Democratic Party for the hard times, not understanding how much the economy relied on the war effort. Harding ran for the presidency, promising this return to peace and prosperity, or a quote-unquote return to normalcy, thus securing the presidency. After the recession and throughout the 1920s, businesses and the American economy rebounded, achieving record highs and creating a whole lot of wealth. Between 1921 and 1929, manufacturing in the U.S. more than doubled, and jobs and wages secured large increases like American salaries, or money people got paid for doing work, roughly doubled from $500 to $1,000 a year. These changes in the economy led to the Americans' ability to purchase new products. The way products were mass-produced via the assembly line led to a price drop on household goods that Americans purchased and changed the way we lived forever. This era in American history became known as the Roaring Twenties. So after President Harding died in office of a heart attack in August 1923, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, rose to the presidency. Coolidge was more of an honest man than Harding, and immediately fired all of the government officials that were involved in the corruption scandals that plagued the Harding administration, and these swift actions slowly restored the nation's faith in the government. President Coolidge quickly gained popularity for his work in office and won his own election in 1924. Coolidge believed that the power of big business and wanted the United States to be a wealthy nation and escape the progressive politics that he felt was holding the nation back, leading Coolidge to support a pro-business agenda when dealing with the economy. President Coolidge placed three major pro-business policies in effect that engaged the economy. First, he raised tariffs or taxes on foreign goods, which decreased foreign competition, helping domestic merchants. Secondly, he eliminated the ban on corporate mergers and trusts. Now businesses were able to gain considerable wealth like the days of the Gilded Age. And lastly, Coolidge lowered the taxes on the wealthy, which would lead to an economic theory called trickle-down economics. The theory of trickle-down economics would be that the government would cut the taxes on the wealthy, and these tax cuts would allow the wealthy business owners to create more jobs for the lower class to take, and in turn, purchase more goods. So the money would trickle down to the American lower wealth. The scenario would basically look like this. The wealthy receive the tax cuts. They would then expand their business, create new jobs that Americans would take and purchase things like food or new products and goods. And then the business owners or the farmers would receive that money, leading to this business boom. So the wealthy getting their tax cuts trickled all the way down to, the good and service provider. And Coolidge's policies killed any progressive era government controls on business, and with the return of laissez-faire or hands-off capitalism, the stock market soared to new heights. Another byproduct of the Coolidge presidency and the surging stock market was the purchasing power of buying on margin. Americans would use margin to purchase large amounts of stock. Margin would allow the average stock trader to purchase more stocks than normal because they would only pay a fraction of the cost of the stock up front, allowing them to purchase a lot more stock. And once the price of the stock rose significantly enough, The stockholder would sell the stock, repay the remainder of the value owed on the original purchase, and pocket the leftovers. And buying on margin was very risky for the buyer and the business because all of the funds were not collected up front, leading to a possibility of very large losses. In this case, the stockholder would be responsible for the whole price of the stock and be in debt to the stock market, which is never a good thing. So who benefited and who didn't benefit from the Roaring Twenties? Not every American benefited from the surging economy, and the list of Americans who did not benefit from the greatest surge of mass consumption in American history is a lot larger than the ones who did benefit from it. So I will go ahead and discuss the four groups and how they were negatively affected during the Roaring Twenties first, and then we'll get to who was. Laborers were negatively affected because during the recession and the return of laissez-faire capitalism, business leaders were put back in charge of the laborers, leading to many labor disputes. Many strikes were broken up by the government, leading to the defeat of many labor union disputes, and as an effect, union membership decreased and wages were not able to keep up with inflation. A second group of Americans who suffered during the 1920s were farmers. The new inventions of machinery allowed farmers to harvest their crops a lot faster than they ever did before, allowing them to harvest a lot more. And unfortunately, this led to an overproduction of crops. With a supply that was too high and a demand that was too low, farmers caused an inflation on their products, which led to a loss of farmer income. A third group of Americans that didn't bode well during the Roaring Twenties were the Native Americans. Natives still had not won many court cases leading to their rights and the progression of Native Americans in America. The majority were still living on reservations, which was land set aside by the government, and successes were rare. Most reservations were without any running water or heat, which led to natives having the shortest lifespan of any American, as well as they had the highest unemployment rate of the decade. The final group of Americans who suffered during the 20s were, of course, the African Americans. It was supposed to be a great time of cultural celebration. The emancipation of those held in bondage was sure to lead to the success and equality of African Americans across the nation. However, this was not the case. White supremacy had risen during a decade, leading to many black Americans leaving the South, their families, and their cultural roots. This was called the Great Migration. The Great Migration was this time before World War I, where millions of African Americans left the South to escape Jim Crow segregation and discrimination and moved to the North to take factory jobs left behind by white men heading off to war. Factory managers were looking for a new source of cheap labor, and they found it with millions of black men. This led to a slightly higher standing of living for black Americans, and newly arrived African Americans in the North would be forced, arguably by the government, to live in slums and run down parts of the city like Harlem, New York. Many musicians and authors would tell stories about the history of African Americans as well as create new legacies. This would all end, however, when after the war, millions of the white men came back from Europe and wanted their jobs back. During the 1920s, African Americans experienced high unemployment and were paid drastically less than their white counterparts. So who did benefit from the thriving economy of the 1920s? Well, it just seemed to be basically the white population in the North who traded stock and owned businesses. So what about this growing economy in America? The 1920s was a decade of increasing conveniences for the middle class. Mass production, or the production of abundance of products, made life easier for American people, which also helped boost the economy. The Roaring Twenties led to a growth of industries and a period of mass consumption. Mass consumption is when the average level of consumption is very high and people consume a large amount of goods. The booming economy created a higher purchasing power, which led to a society of mass consumption. And what fueled this craze of mass consumption? Advertising. Advertising, which is telling Americans what they needed and why. New ways of advertising in the theaters or on radio spread the word of consumer goods across the nation. Advertisers would capitalize on people's hopes, dreams, and fears to sell more product. Advertising was not a new concept. However, ad agencies would use more aggressive advertising campaigns for their goods. Americans would hear such things like, if the Reds use this one type of dish soap, then don't buy it, buy American. Or 9 out of 10 doctors agree, you should give your baby soda in a bottle. Advertisers no longer were required to wait for the demand of a product. They would now create the demand. They would use famous actors or sports personalities to go on the radio and pitch their products to the masses, causing the demand to skyrocket. And what type of goods would these actors or sports people advertise for? Well, for the most part, it was things that made life easier for Americans. During the 1920s, Americans saw an increase in leisure time due to the inventions of electronic devices. Electricity was becoming more widespread in the United States, and more homes were taking advantage of the new conveniences. Gone were the days of taking carpets outside to beat dirt from, or washing clothes on a washing board and hanging them out to dry, or even changing the ice block in the ice box. Women would usually spend the whole day doing household chores inside and out. And in the 20s, consumers purchased large amounts of things like vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and refrigerators to save hours and hours of work and make lives easier. New electric stoves and irons were purchased as well, all to make life easier, and women didn't need to make their families clothes anymore either. Now they could just buy it off the shelf at stores. Americans now had much more time to do as they please. And many Americans purchased radios and listened to the advertisements and sporting events, but during the 1920s, it was that radio that brought the daily news to the masses. Boy, oh boy, what a time to be alive. Since the turn of the century, the Ford Motor Company had been producing vehicles for Americans to purchase. Originally, they were expensive and only the few rich could afford them. However, the car itself had an incredible effect on the economy. Roads that were not existent or were made of dirt and full of dangerous potholes would break cars' axles. This led to the increase of factory jobs. Employment rose as parts were needed for automobile production. Also, the United States government spent millions of dollars improving roads across the nation, which allowed new businesses opportunities like gas stations, motels, hotels, and restaurants to spring up along the roadways to serve all these travelers. Remember Henry Ford? Henry Ford dreamed of building a car that he could sell to the masses. He's this inventor that invented the Ford Motor Company. And he did this by cutting the costs of production through mass production and the assembly line. Ford's assembly line would use a system of conveyor belts to move parts from one group of workers to another, thus saving time on the production line. Also, Ford was famous for saying you can have any car in any color that you want as long as it was black, because using only one color would also cut the production cost of the car. All these measures helped Ford lower the cost of his automobile from $800 down to $300, which allowed many Americans to purchase this car. The number of registered car owners soared from 8 million in 1920 to over 20 million in 1929. The automobile changed the way Americans lived. They could now take jobs further away from where they lived, and they can travel more using this newly acquired free time to give them a sense of freedom and adventure. A final way that Ford helped the American public was with the purchase of American expensive products like automobiles was the incorporation of the installment plan, otherwise known as credit. Ford's customers would buy cars using an installment plan or credit. This is known better as the buy now, pay later effect on the purchase of goods. The basis behind credit is that you can purchase something, take it with you, and pay it back using an installment payment plan. Americans would put a little money down on the car and pay the remainder of the balance through smaller payments throughout the year or even multiple years. The money borrowed would have interest on it or a small percentage added on every month as a charge for borrowing the money. If a person defaulted on the loan or couldn't pay it back, the company would repossess or take the car back, and Americans were now living in this great age of credit. On society, in the 1920s, many young Americans found a new type of independence in the changing society. As men came home from war, they moved into the cities, and for the first time in American history, more than half the nation's population lived in urban areas. Many young people took advantage of the purchasing power of credit and the economic boom of the 1920s to gain independence, and a new youth culture developed in America. The urbanization and wealth of Americans had more access to higher education as well. In the 1920s, high school attendance doubled, and more Americans attended colleges and universities than any other country in the world. Women were also experiencing success, in the number of women in the workforce continued to grow. Women also sought new roles as lawyers, doctors, and politicians, and by the end of the 1920s, women made up 5% of the national workforce. So with all that time and extra money that many Americans had during this time, they had a lot of leisure time. So what were people doing? They were flocking to baseball games, movies, and the theater. Slapstick comedies featuring Charlie Chaplin flashed across the screens, and The First Picture with Sound premiered in 1927. Walt Disney introduced the world to Mickey Mouse the following year when he released Steamboat Willie. And by the end of the decade, over 100 million viewers attended movies each week, more than a number of weekly churchgoers. New icons like baseball phenom Babe Ruth became more mainstream than ever. During the 1920s, women had finally won the war against suffrage rights when they earned the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And women began to celebrate across the nation, particularly in the Northeast. Arising in this northern part of the United States was a type of woman known as a flapper. Traditionally, women across the nation would have long hair. They would work at home. They would wear traditionally long covering dresses. They would not engage in such things as drinking alcohol, smoking, or the nightlife scene. But during the 1920s, a generation of young women openly challenged the traditional ideas of how women were supposed to behave. Flappers were northern, urban, single, young, middle-class women who normally held a steady job and were ready to party. During the day, they would work as clerks, phone operators, and department sales associates, but at night, they were ready to play. First, let's look at their style. Flappers would normally cut their hair short in a type of bob or style it as such, and instead of long body-covering dresses, flappers wore miniskirts. They would frequently attend jazz clubs and speakeasies, which were illegal hidden bars because of Prohibition. Flappers engaged in public smoking and illegal consumption of alcohol. They believed that if men could do it, they could do it too. And young flappers ignored any traditional values. As African Americans migrated to the north, as I had mentioned before, they migrated to the slums of New York City, to a place called Harlem. Many writers and artists moved there and introduced new styles of artistic ideas, and the Harlem neighborhood became the epicenter of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a period of African American artistic and cultural accomplishments. Writers of the Harlem Renaissance made lasting contributions to American culture, and no one may have had such an impact as Langston Hughes. Hughes wrote poems, plays, and novels about African American life, and in 1930, his first novel, Not Without Laughter, won the Harmon Gold Medal for Literature. He wanted to tell the stories of African Americans in ways that reflected their actual culture. This included love of music and laughter, but also included their suffering. Other Renaissance writers were Claude McKay, who was an activist and a poet who spoke out against racial discrimination, and Zora Neale, who wrote about the experiences of African American women. Music was another form of artistic expression that African Americans contributed to American history. During the 1920s, jazz and blues music became popular nationwide. And since jazz exploded so quickly and was so popular in the 1920s, it was also nicknamed the Jazz Age. Developed in New Orleans and blending African American, European, and West African harmonies and rhythms, jazz gave young Americans something to dance to, and it was hugely popular. Fast-paced dance crazes like the Charleston swept across the nation. Jazz musicians were innovators. They would use improvised musical solos, meaning that rarely were two musical sets the same. And two of the most famous jazz musicians were Louis Armstrong and Edward Duke Ellington. Blues music became popular during the 1920s as well, and blues was not as upbeat as jazz. It originated in the rural south of Mississippi, using a bass that expressed suffering of African Americans during slavery and the segregated South. Blues was predominantly played by black musicians and covered the range of emotions. Some songs were witty or satirical adaptations of life, and one of the most famous blues artists of the 1920s was Mammy Smith. During the 1920s, competing ideals caused conflicts between Americans with traditional beliefs and those with modern views. Religious leaders were concerned about the youth culture in America, like flappers, and the failure of Prohibition, which was the illegal sale, manufacture, and consumption of alcohol. The religious idea was that Americans should turn to traditional values and return to the tradition of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism was characterized by the belief in the literal word-for-word interpretation of the Bible. Since the youth of America was flocking into urban areas, fundamentalism was the strongest in small towns in rural America. Fundamentalists believed that the modern scientific theories like Darwin's theory of evolution conflicted with the teachings of the Bible, and for that they opposed teaching evolution in public schools. In the 1920s, laws were passed in many states and cities that prohibited the teaching of evolution. This comes to a head in 1925 with the Scopes trial. Tennessee teacher John Scopes was put on trial in 1925 for teaching evolution in school. Commonly known as the Scopes monkey trial, the court case became a literal circus. Media from around the nation flocked to Tennessee to watch the trial in person. Americans were about to find out which way the law felt about the 20s. Were the modernist youth or the traditional fundamentalists right? Ultimately, in the end of the trial, Scopes was found guilty and forced to pay a fine of $100, which is about $1,500 in today's inflation, for breaking the Butler Act, which forbade the teaching and evolution of public-funded schools. The state would eventually repeal the Butler Act and overturn Scopes' conviction, but many scholars today argue that the result of the Scopes trial is the reason why the theory of evolution is not taught in schools today. Another competing idea among traditionalists and modernists was the consumption of alcohol. Women fought tirelessly throughout the temperance movement, and their goals had finally been achieved in the passing of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was also called Prohibition, and it outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. The law was almost impossible to enforce because many young Americans would either make alcohol at home with household goods or visit those speakeasies, which what we recall are illegal hidden bars. Sometimes the bar would be behind a secret door that you can only access with a secret knock. And many young Americans broke the law when it came to alcohol, like mafia bootlegger Al Capone, who made millions of dollars transporting liquor in cars that they made faster and with larger motors. This would allow them to outrun the police vehicles, and bootlegging would ultimately lead to the creation of NASCAR. The law reduced the consumption of alcohol, but failed to stop Americans from drinking it. Of course, like everything else in the 1920s, Prohibition was supported mostly in small rural towns and opposed mostly by the young urbanites in the cities. By the end of the 1920s, the nation was feeling the effects of Prohibition. The government usually collected taxes on alcohol and has been losing money for a decade, and Congress believed that it would be better to have a legal alcohol trade with the government monitoring it, and Prohibition ended with the passing of the 21st Amendment in 1933 with celebrations across the country. So, what happens at the end of the 1920s? Everything seemed to be going so good. At the end of the 1920s, there was another presidential election, the election of 1928, and Americans rode this Republican train, electing businessman and philanthropist Herbert Hoover into the presidency. Americans strongly supported Hoover and hoped that he would help keep the Financial Times moving. And Hoover promised that he would keep economic prosperity and promised Americans a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Hoover even campaigned against Democratic governor of New York, Alfred Smith, who Alfred Smith focused his issues on urban areas while ignoring the vast rural areas of America. Also, Smith was the first Catholic to run for president. The combination of these two issues was a deadly cocktail for Smith as he lost the vote, as Hoover collected nearly 58% of the popular vote. Can Hoover continue America's successes? I guess we'll have to wait and see.